According to Avalanche.org, there are 24 avalanche fatalities in the U.S. during last year's winter season. There have already been 8 deaths so far this season in the U.S. I'm Doug Canfield, and this is Mountaineers Books web series. Tonight, Bruce Tremper will be sharing tips for staying alive in avalanche terrain, specifically how choosing the right terrain can help you stay safe in the winter backcountry. Many of you may know Bruce. Until his retirement in 2017, he had been the director of the Utah Avalanche Center, where he worked for nearly 30 years. He is also the author of the popular book, Staying Alive in Avalanche Terrain, which has just come out in its 3rd edition. Avalanche courses all over the country use or recommend staying alive to their students. He also wrote the book Avalanche Essentials, a step-by-step system for safety and survival. And he has a laminated field reference called the Avalanche Pocket Guide. Bruce has spent the greater part of his life studying snow science and teaching others how to play in it safely. This seminar is co-sponsored with our sister nonprofit organization, the Colorado Mountain Club. CMC is a member-driven outdoor club founded in 1912, whose mission is to serve and educate Coloradans, encouraging them to become respectful and responsible recreators. Also co-sponsoring this event is the innovative gear manufacturer Black Diamond. Founded in 1957, Black Diamond is all about skiing and climbing. This year, they're especially excited about the technology in their new avalanche beacons, which will be available individually or in a snow safety bundle, along with the shovel and probe. By the way, Black Diamond is also hosting Bruce for a presentation tomorrow evening in their Salt Lake City store. So if you're in the area and want to meet Bruce, that's a good event to attend. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I should say that Colorado Mountain Club, if you want to visit them and learn more about them, you can find them online at cmc.org. And you can also check out all of Black Diamond's new winter gear at blackdiamondequipment.com. So, all right, let's get started. We're going to go for 1 hour and have a hard stop at the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to fill them out or put them in, submit them, that's the word, as we go along. And then we'll get to those after Bruce's presentation, which will last about 35 minutes. All right, that's your cue, Bruce. We're anxious to hear what wisdom you have for us.
All right. Thank you so much, Doug. And by the way, I'll be giving a presentation in Colorado, Durango, Colorado, on the 29th of January, I believe it is. So if you're in the area, stop by. What I'm going to talk about tonight is avalanche terrain, and that's the most important part of avalanches. And here I'm showing you kind of the big picture of what avalanches are all about. This little, what I call the avalanche smart car that I've got in my other books. And so here's snowpack and terrain, and what you're doing is balancing the danger of the snowpack with the danger of the terrain. And this person in the middle, which would be us, is doing that balancing. And notice that person in the middle is also affected by these human factors as well. So then you get a critical decision point. Do you bet with your life? And if you do, then you go to the next slide, excuse me, which would be dealing with the exposure and the vulnerability part of the avalanche risk equation. And I'm not going to talk about exposure, going one at a time, escape routes and stuff like that. I'm not going to talk about vulnerability, which means rescue gear and rescue techniques and all that stuff. What we are going to talk about is just zero in on the terrain part of this, not on the snowpack, not on the human factors. So it's just kind of one small part of the avalanche game. But this is the most important part by far, because take-home lesson number 1 is when snowpack, weather, or people are the question, terrain is always the answer. In other words, terrain is kind of like using the steering wheel on your car. It gives you control over what your risk is, because you're choosing the terrain that has a certain kind of snowpack. You're choosing the terrain that has a certain kind of steepness, certain kind of consequences. Terrain is the one thing that we have total control over. And and it's the easiest part to figure out because it's just permanent. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't move. And but it takes a long time to learn terrain. It takes a lifetime to learn terrain, as some people say, sometimes 2 lifetimes, because terrain can be very complex. And let's just start looking at pictures, and that's why I like teaching about terrain, because you're in the world, you're looking at pictures. Here we have 2 avalanches. We also have ski tracks going by here, and the people who made these ski tracks did not trigger avalanches, but avalanches did occur here, and they occurred here. Why is that? Why is that? Is it the shape of the terrain? Is it the direction the slope's facing? Is it, what aspect of terrain, what parameter of terrain caused that? Well, it's about steepness. Steepness is by far the most important thing to consider about terrain. This is steep terrain up here. It's close to 40 degrees. So is this. But the ski tracks are all on gentle terrain. None of this stuff is steeper than about 20 degrees here. You're never, ever going to get an avalanche on terrain like this. So that's the #1 lesson, is if you want to control your risk, you just control the steepness of the slope. That's a really, really easy choice to make. For me personally, I stay on slopes less than 30 degrees almost all the time, unless I can prove that that snowpack is going to be stable. Snow is guilty until proven innocent, and so therefore I stick on 30-degree slopes or less, unless I'm 99.9% confident of the snowpack that'll let me get onto something like this or something like this that might kill me. So let's look at terrain. Let's look at a graph of terrain. Now, I'm a scientist. I love graphs. Okay, so forgive me for that. And there'll be a few of them in here. But let me explain this graph. On the vertical axis, this is the number of avalanches that are occurring, the percent of human-triggered avalanches occurring at each degree of slope steepness. This was done in Switzerland, almost 1,000 data points, measured avalanches start zones as measured by the way the only Swiss can do it, and you can bet that it's measured correctly if they're doing it. And so this is a great graph. It's filled in, it's smoothed out. I was really excited when this graph came out because I've been looking for data exactly like this. And so 39 degrees was the bullseye that they came up with of these almost 1,000 avalanches that they measured. And notice that a couple things about this. So one is that you have safety on the steep side of the curve and the gentle side of the curve. Most of us mere mortals were on this side of the curve. We're not skiing or snowboarding or snowmobiling or whatever you were doing. We're not much steeper than 40 degrees most of the time. 40 degrees is quite steep. And so now my friends who are extreme skiers in Alaska, they find safety on this side of the curve. They're in the 50-degree range, and the place that they're triggering avalanches is at the bottom of the slope where it flattens out to 40 degrees again. For most of us, we're triggering avalanches here, and we're finding our safety down here where only less than 30 degrees, only 3% of avalanches are occurring. So the second thing to notice about this is you can cut your risk in half by going from 39 degrees down to 4% here, which is 34 degrees. So go from 39 degrees to 34 degrees, you automatically cut your risk in half. You cut your probability of triggering an avalanche in half. That's a pretty good deal. And then you can cut your probability of triggering an avalanche in half again, going from 4% to 2%, if you're going down to about 31 degrees or something like that. So this is the steering wheel in your car. This is how you control your risk, by controlling the probability of triggering an avalanche. Notice it's not a linear curve, that it's a exponential curve, as we call it. So you're twice as more likely to trigger here than here, and twice as likely going from there to there. So it happens very, very quickly. So the difference between 39 degrees and 30 degrees doesn't seem like much to people, but it's extremely important to the avalanches. That's the important part. Okay, here we go. There's an avalanche here, broke out this entire bowl. This is very similar to the avalanche that I triggered here. I was standing right above this tree here. My wife and I skied along, and it was a very dangerous day. And I just jumped real hard right here above this tree. And by collapsing that slope, that collapse traveled outwards. And when it got over the edge here and it got onto something that was steep enough to slide, then the whole thing slid out. Very, very similar to this. This is on a little bit different day where there's better visibility. But you know, the avalanche doesn't occur here. That's why I felt perfectly safe on this 20-degree slope. I've never seen an avalanche up there. But I can trigger the entire mountainside just by jumping here. And if I jump here, I'm going to die. Okay, and if I'm here, I'm very, very safe. So that's a pretty cool thing. Slope steepness is really, really important. Now, in some cases where the slab is hard and you have a real slippery weak layer, which is surface hoar in this case, fancy name for frost. So the slab is sliding here and it kind of pulls the slab along for the ride, kind of like a child down here pulling the tablecloth off the table. Pulls everything off the flat part of the table. So you have to be a little bit careful being up here to not get too close to the edge because it can suck up over the edge. So that's one big caveat. So you got to remember, what is the slope connected to? You know, locally connected terrain is really important. So here's some skiers once again, helicopter skiing in Canada, as you might guess. And in this case, the guy just kind of bopped over to the edge just to kind of take a look and got a little too close to the edge, did not get caught because there's a return track coming back, so it had a happy ending. But you can see how sensitive these cornices are, how far they pull back over the edge. So this locally connected terrain is really, really important as far as steepness. You can trigger avalanches from the bottom, you can trigger them from the side, you can trigger them from up on top when the conditions are really unstable. You can travel long distances, cross-terrain features. Here's two skiers. And in this case, there is another skier that came down on top of these two other skiers, which is not a very nice thing to do to your friends. You know, on ski patrols is considered to be tantamount to attempted homicide. Is anytime you come down on top of your partners like this, you don't ever do that. And in this case, they triggered an avalanche right on top of them. So the avalanche could have been triggered from here. They could have just as easily collapsed the slope here and triggered it coming from above, but this person triggered it when they got to the steepest part of the slope. This is the part of the slope that's going to control whether an avalanche occurs there or not. So this is the locally connected terrain that I'm talking about. So this is the part that's closest to 39 degrees is the avalanche starting zone where the avalanche is most likely going to initiate. But you can trigger it from over here. You can trigger it from on top. You can trigger it from over here, maybe even down here. And triggering it from the bottom, a lot of people trigger them from the bottom, and if you trigger them from the bottom, then the whole world comes right down on top of you. So you have to really be careful, like I say. What is that terrain connected to? It's not just about steepness, it's about the locally connected terrain. So take home lesson number 2. It's extremely important, like I say. 39 degrees is a bullseye. You get safety both steeper and less steep than 39 degrees. It also includes the steepness of the locally connected terrain. Okay, here we have a little bit different kind of terrain. There's a snowmobiling terrain, and here we have smaller slopes. And is this steep enough to slide? Is that steep enough to slide? Is that close to 40 degrees? Yes, it is. Is this steep enough to slide? Yes, this is. All these little rollovers are steep enough to slide, just like this big slope in the background. But what am I looking at here that would make me rather jump on this slope instead of this slope? Excuse me. The difference is what I call consequences. What happens if it slides? Well, the consequences of triggering an avalanche here are much less dangerous than triggering on the big slope behind. In fact, I love terrain like this. These is where I call it test slopes. So you can go jump on those, you know, fairly safely, as long as you have a partner and you're there with your beacon and stuff, in case, you know, you do get buried. But you're probably not going to die on something like this. You definitely could die on something like this. So this is where you gather information. The snowpack is on these little test slopes here. I just love stuff like this. These are gifts from the avalanche gods, and don't pass these by. Go jump on them before you go jump on that thing. Okay, so the other bad consequence is what we call terrain traps. So this is really, really dangerous spot right here, because even a small avalanche off of either side can bury somebody very, very deeply in the bottom of this terrain trap, in this gully. So if you're a snowboarder or a or a skier, it looks like a half pipe. You can have a lot of fun in here, but you got to really be careful of these things because they're very, very dangerous. You can have the most expensive rescue gear in the world, and it probably won't save your life in here, because you're going to be at the bottom and all this stuff's going to get plunked down on top of you. You're going to be buried so deep that people can't dig you out. So your rescue gear just doesn't do you as much good in terrain like that. Your rescue gear doesn't do you that much good in terrain like this. You're just going to get chewed up through all these rocks, getting ground up all the way down, and then buried in a terrain trap at the bottom. It's an extremely dangerous terrain with lots of different avalanche starting zones coming together, piling up the debris in a small area that could bury you very, very deeply. This is basically unsurvivable terrain. So consequences are really important. Trees are another thing that's really important to think about. Trees are anchors, meaning that if they're thick enough, they can help to hold the slab in place, because, you know, they're just like pushing thumbtacks through a piece of cardboard or pounding nails into a piece of cardboard. It's hard to pull that cardboard off of a sloping surface or off the wall, because the trees are kind of helping to anchor it in place. But they have to be thick. They have to be quite thick to anchor the slab in place. If they're not very thick, avalanches can start and run through these sparse trees just as easy as no trees at all. And then these anchors, your best friends, suddenly turn into your worst enemies, because you are traveling at freeway speeds, smashing into these trees. And if you want to know what they feel like, just get on your bicycle or a motorcycle and start heading down a steep hill until you're going about 60 miles an hour, and just steer it into a telephone pole, and that's what these things are going to feel like when you hit them. That's why 1 out of 4 avalanche victims are killed by trauma from hitting trees and rocks on the way down. They don't even get a chance to suffocate under the avalanche debris. They're killed by trauma. So these trees can mean safety if they're anchoring the snow in place, or they could also mean extreme danger because they're obstacles in the avalanche path that you don't want to hit. So, I mean, let's take a look at a slope like this. And it already has some ski tracks on it, and it's not particularly steep. This is about 35 degrees, I would say. But what happens if you do trigger an avalanche? Well, first you get strain through the giant bread slicer that'll be stuck in high gear. It's going to rip you limb from limb going through these little aspens, which are a disaster species, I might add. They grow in places that get hit by avalanches because they grow back quickly. And then after that, if you're not killed by the trees, you're deposited in this very deep terrain trap at the bottom. So my avalanche eyeballs, I take a look at something like this, and it looks very dangerous to me. But for most skiers and snowboarders and snowmobilers, you look at this and it looks like a lot of fun, gladed trees. So, you know, it's really important to look at terrain with your avalanche eyeballs on. What's going to happen if it slides? So here we are in Canada, and I kind of was breaking a trail up here, and the rest of them were down here. The reason why I stopped to take this picture, to let my friends pass me, is because here's a choice. Do you go on a convex slope like this, or do you go up a gully like this? And so, like I was already talking about, this is a terrain trap. Even small avalanches could bury you deeply. So most of the time, I like to avoid stuff like this. This is why I kind of broke off from the group and came up here, because I would rather go here and then rejoin the trail to get over to here than to go up the bottom. So that's why I took this, or put this photo in there. The other thing you have to think about with terrain is we used to talk about slope shape a lot. And in other words, is a convex slope like this. So this is convex, like the outside of a basketball. It's vexing outward. And this is concave slope down here. So it's caved in like the inside of a bowl. And so we used to say that these convex slopes were the most dangerous ones, because this is where the avalanches occur. It gets steeper and steeper, and that's where we always see these fracture lines, is right at the convexity of the slope. And but the Swiss finally studied this a few years ago and found that just as what I suspected, is that this is just not true. And we've been teaching it for years because it just seems like it's true. And they've found just as many avalanches on planar slopes or concave slopes as any other slopes, and no more on the convexities. Sometimes you'll see the fracture lines on the convexities, but it doesn't mean that this slope is more dangerous. Now these are dangerous for other reasons, because when you're coming down something like this, they just keep getting steeper and steeper and steeper. You can't quite see over the edge, so you can creep into a terrain that's more dangerous than what you want to be on. But what controls this is, once again, the steepness of the slope. The closer it is to 39 degrees, that's the important part. Not so much the shape of the slope like we used to think. And you still see a lot of people teach that these convexities are dangerous, but we found out that they're not. Now this is dangerous down here because it's a suddenly it's steep and then goes flat. So the debris really piles up in the bottom of this terrain trap down here. So take home lesson number 3. Consequences. What happened if it slides is very important. Bad consequences. It can include terrain traps. It can include trees or rocks to hit, or cliffs or crevasses, or just plain large terrain. Those are all bad things, places to be. So if we look at this, here's pictures of dangerous terrain, kind of medium terrain, and usually safe terrain. There's less than 30 degrees. This is 31 to 34 degrees, and just has a few little breakovers in here. There are a few obstacles to hit, but then there's quite big terrain here. It's all, prime time avalanche terrain. And if you trigger an avalanche here that goes 3,000 vertical feet to the bottom, it's going to take you a long time to get down to the bottom to unbury your friend, or this terrain is quite dangerous. And so I would call that red light as far as probability and consequences. Probability is controlled by the steepness of the slope. Consequences controlled by what happens if it slides. This is medium, so I color it yellow in this part and green in this part. On this graph where we can compare the combination between the probability and the consequence of an avalanche. So in Canada, you'll hear them use the ATES rating, the Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale rating, and they would call something like this simple terrain, something like this challenging terrain, and something like this complex terrain. And you're seeing more and more places rated with these ATES ratings. They're doing as many places in Canada as they can, also in Europe as well. So you'll see those as well. So those are pretty handy things to look for. But let's continue to plot this on a scale like this. This is the increasing probability of an avalanche depending on the steepness, like I just said. These are the consequences, like I was just talking about. Safe, medium, and dangerous terrain. Got that? So anchors, thick anchors in the starting zone can decrease the probability of an avalanche because it can help to hold the slab in place. They also stabilize the snow a little bit too, just because the trees are there. And then if anchors below you that are especially sparse anchors, then they increase the consequences, increase bad consequences. So anchors can push this way or this way, depending on how they are. So let's look at this. Here's a probability consequence plot, a standard risk type of plot, or hazard plot as we call them. And let's take a look at this piece of terrain right here with the circle around it. Is this steep enough to slide? You bet. This is close to 39, 40 degrees. So it's high probability of triggering an avalanche. How about the consequences of it? Well, it's a small slope. It's a small test slope. So where would we plot it on the probability consequence scale? I would put it about there. So it's low consequences. So you push it to this left side, and then it's high probability. So it's here. So it kind of plots in there someplace. So this is how I like to teach avalanches. And I'll just go through and see if we can develop some of our avalanche eyeballs about how dangerous the piece of terrain is. This one, same thing. It's a small slope, high probability, but low consequences. So it might plot in there someplace. But you can see that we're in very complex, dangerous terrain. So this would be a difficult thing to travel through. You really got to know what you're doing if you travel through something like this. But you can operate in this terrain as long as you watch your steepness and watch your consequences. You can do a lot of fun things in places like this. Maybe you can even sneak up this ramp here. Once you start getting up in here, then you start to get yourself into some trouble. You got to really know what you're doing up there. Okay, big dangerous terrain, but once again, low probability or high probability, low consequences. Same thing. Does this make sense? And then let's take a look at this piece of terrain. So kind of medium steepness. It's about 35 degrees, not a real high probability of triggering an avalanche. And if you do, what happens? We have a nice smooth run out. There's no obstacles to hit. It's gets gentle pretty slowly, so it's not a big terrain trap. So your rescue gear at least has a chance to work in terrain like this. And most likely it would save your life if you're with a good partner and you have good rescue gear, avalanche airbags and avalanche transceivers and so on. So it's kind of medium terrain. That's where I would plot it. How about this spot? Same kind of thing. It's kind of medium terrain for probability and consequences. If you do trigger an avalanche here, you kind of come down the gully. There's not really too much to hit. Your rescue gear has a chance to save you. Same thing here, kind of medium probability, medium consequences. So that's why I try to train people to look at avalanche terrain like this over and over and over until you develop your avalanche eyeballs. This is a tricky one. This upper slope here, it's not all that steep and it's kind of surrounded by trees. If you're standing up here, it doesn't look very dangerous, but what you can't see is what's over the edge. You've got your basic nightmare. You got rocks, you have trees, you're going to get beat to death by the time you get to the bottom of this slope. It's probably an unsurvivable slope right below you, but you can't see it from up here. So I would plot it over there. Low probability of, medium probability of triggering an avalanche, but if you do, you're going to be in a world of hurt. And this one is an obvious one. Everybody would plot that in the upper right. That's a nasty place. And this is that same slope that we were looking at before, where it's difficult to trigger an avalanche. Here it's not all that steep, but you've got bad trees and a bad terrain trap at the bottom. So this is kind of what we do. Let's look at a piece of terrain like this. Just choose a route. The steepest part, the place most likely to produce an avalanche, would be this stuff that I've colored red here. And that's exactly the kind of place you want to ski. It's just, or snowboard or snowmobile, because it's just the perfect steepness. You can have the most fun here. But the consequences, look at all the bread slicer you'd have to go through. So if you are going to choose a route through this, it's better to choose it on gentler terrain over here where there's more anchors as trees, or be on a convex slope, a ridge like up here where you're not on anything steep. You can work your way up something like this. So for me, I'm always looking at the routes. Where do I want to be on my ascent route? Because the ascent routes, if you're a skier or a boarder, have to be safer than your descent routes, where you can take more chances because you have more escapes. But when you're ascending, you got your climbing skins on, you're going slow, so you can't make any mistakes. Snowmobiling is, completely different. You have to watch both your ascent routes and your descent routes. So let's just talk a little bit about pre-trip planning. Here's my wife using the phone. This is how I measure slope steepness, and there's lots of different apps that you can do that. I like to sight down the slope, down the tangent of the slope, so you can, instead of laying it on a ski pole or something, or laying it on the slope, this is much more accurate to measure it this way. So just measure your favorite slopes, know what the steepness is, and compare it with that graph. Now on the Wasatch Backcountry Skiing app that we have in Utah, it's cool. Steve put colored in brownish red here all the slopes that are avalanche terrain, the ones that are about 35 degrees to 45 degrees. So with the app, you can automatically see where the dangerous slopes are to plan your route. So that's a pretty good thing. On the Utah Avalanche Center website, we've got some of the AT's rating for, and they do it on a more complex thing using all these, looking at all these different parameters. I make it simpler, just looking at steepness, consequences, and anchors, like I just said, like I just explained. So on the website, we list a lot of different routes over here and what the rating is: red, orange, yellow, and so on. You can click on the details. So that's one way to do it. In Canada, they've got a lot of things on the website that you can choose routes also. So for the terrain summary, steepness, closer to 39 degrees, the more dangerous it is. Consequences, very important. Thick trees can help anchor the slab, but sparse trees are obstacles to hit on the way down. That's the take-home point for terrain. And I've gone along for my allotted time. We're going to take about 30 minutes to answer people's questions. That's the final slide.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. You've got some great slides there. Of course, I've seen this one before, but I love seeing it again. So thanks a lot. It's a good refresher. I know I used your book in the way back, the first edition in the course I took for backcountry ski and snowboarding. And yet, it's great to get this stuff over and over. So we got some questions. Carl Gable has a question. He says, what is your insider view of the future of AVI beacons? It seems to me you had a design team start, if you had a design team start from scratch and say, how do we want these things to work? I don't think it would be present user interface, technology limitations, thoughts. I'm not sure I got all of Carl's question, but he's asking what you think about beacons.
I think that's a really good question. And, a lot of people like me and everybody else spend a lot of time thinking about technology because, we're Americans. It's our birthright to think that we can just buy the perfect gizmo and then we won't have to think anymore. That's all of our dream. And I've been in the avalanche business for 40 some odd years, and I've seen all kinds of things come along: the avalanche beacon, the Avalon, the airbag, and I started out with having avalanche cords behind me when I skied. And every time new technology comes along, they say it's going to revolutionize the avalanche world, and then we're not going to have fatalities anymore. But it hasn't come to pass yet, and it's probably not going to. Beacons are really good gizmos. They work really well, but that don't save everybody. They're probably, most of the statistics and most of the studies say that they might save about half the people. So beacons don't, or transceivers as we're trying to call them these days, so they don't get confused with personal locator beacons. Transceivers don't work if you're buried in a terrain trap, or if you're hitting anchors on the way down, and so on. So there's a lot of cases where they just don't work, and people think that they're better with their transceivers than they really are. They need to practice a lot more than they think that you do. But they're only going to save about half of the people. And then same with avalanche airbags. When they came along, the statistics were wildly optimistic. They were saying they were 97% effective, but they were looking at everybody that got caught with an airbag, including all the people who would never have gotten buried in an avalanche to begin with, just everybody wearing an airbag getting caught. So when they did more serious studies and just looking at cases where the avalanche airbag had a chance to make a difference, it was the same thing, that they were saving about half the people, actually a little bit less than half the people in the most recent study. So they're not a panacea either. Same thing, terrain traps, they're not going to work, or if the avalanche doesn't move far enough for that inverse gradation to float you to the top, they're not going to work. Or if it's a secondary burial, or if you hit trees and rocks on the way down, they're not going to work. So avalanche airbags, there's a lot of cases where they just don't work. But both those technologies work quite well. And if if you're responsible with them and use them the way they're meant to be used, then they work quite well, actually. We're pretty encouraged that the avalanche numbers have really flatlined for the last 20 years, even though the use in the backcountry just keeps going up and up and up. There's a lot more people in the backcountry now than there ever were, and the fatality numbers are flatlining. We think it's because of education, we think it's because of rescue gear, and we think people are just getting more responsible and just getting good education. So we're really excited about those trends. But just remember that the gizmos are not a panacea.
Bruce, do you want to turn on your webcam? And the audience might enjoy seeing you answer the questions in person.
Oh, I thought it was already on. I thought you turned.
There you go. We see
you. You can see me. Okay. I can't see me, but.
So Rob asks.
Now, unfortunately, you can see me.
Rob asks, what's a good way to evaluate terrain steepness? And I think you talked about technology in that regard. I know when I took the course, it was my course, the course I took. It was using the ski pole and all that. But are you exclusively using the apps now for that?
Yeah, the ones on the phone work really well. There's a lot of different apps. I use Theodolite, which is, I think, a good one, and ones that you can just sight down the slope. And I believe a lot of apps like the Utah Avalanche Center app has it uses the camera within the phone. You can sight down the tangent of the slope, down or up the slope, and that's a pretty accurate way to measure it. A lot of times with phones, you have to calibrate them first, so remember to do that.
Did you ever have any trouble with the phones being affected by the cold?
Not really. I'd keep it in a pocket and keep the phone warm.
Okay.
So, yeah, I use the phone a lot.
Next question is sort of a housekeeping thing, and Jeff asks, will we be sending out a recording? And we will. And also, if we don't get to all of the questions, we'll forward them to Bruce to answer individually.
Giving me some homework.
Let's see. Regarding the start zone steepness, is there a chance that the reason 50-degree slopes see so little avalanche captures because few people ski that steep terrain? Is that just the reason?
Yeah, good question. And my apologies. I forgot to mention that the reason why it's that way at 50 degrees or steeper than 39 degrees is because the snow sloughs so often that it doesn't build up into slabs. So it actually it's actually more stable snow. The worst snow is right at 39 degrees because that's where slabs build up. And steeper than that, sloughs all the time. Gentler than that, then there's just the gravity is pulling the slope pulling well, it's just not steep enough to slide when you get on gentler slopes.
So we're stepping back to slope steepness, and Robert's saying that using DEM data can be off by a few degrees, which can make the difference. It's good to verify slopes in the field, even if you have great DEM/data topo data.
That's exactly right. And I wish I had $5 for every time someone suggested that to me, because I could probably have retired years ago, because everybody wants, like I say, the perfect gizmo so they don't have to think anymore. So, this day and age, why can't you just plot a map to say where it's dangerous and where it's not? And it's just because of that exact, what he's talking about is the digital elevation model data is just not accurate enough to pick up all the little undulations in the slopes or little gully sides or small features, and it's just not accurate enough. I mean, maybe the day it's already coming in a lot of places where they're doing LiDAR mapping, so it's very, very accurate. But even that is better just to verify it yourself when you're on the slope, measure it, and if you're there on the slope, you can see all the little undulations. I encourage everybody just to get a feel for it, just to go out on a really unstable day on a really small test slope and jump on lots of avalanches, make lots of avalanches, so you can see exactly what kind of slopes they slide on and what is that steepness, that critical steepness. Just go on a 10-foot high side of a stump or a road cut or something like that. Just play with it and have fun with avalanches so you get a feel for what kind of slopes are dangerous.
Nan asks a question, have you been caught in an avalanche? And we've got a lot of questions, so I just want to refer you, Nan, to our website where we've got an excerpt from Bruce's book, which tells all about him being overconfident and being caught in an avalanche. And it's a really good story. It's in his introduction, and I'll brag on Bruce and tell you that he's a good writer, and we've gotten a lot of response to that particular story. Anything to add to that story?
No, I was once an avalanche expert when I was young and had read the Avalanche Handbook and and my father taught me about avalanches when I was 10 years old, so I thought I was an avalanche expert, and I found out pretty quickly I was not. And I was taught that by that particular avalanche, and you're just going to have to read the book if you want this story.
And that particular story you can even find on mountaineersbooks.org. We've excerpted for you. I'll give you a feel for the way the writing is in the rest of the book. I believe you said, this is from Danielle, I believe you said you stay on 30-degree slopes or less most or all of the time. Is that correct? Are there ever conditions under which you are comfortable going steeper?
Yeah, when the snowpack is really stable and I'm very confident about that snowpack, I'll go on steeper slopes. But, I need to get out my shovel and do lots of digging and do lots of homework before I trust it. Snow is guilty until proven innocent. I've just seen too many bad things happen through the years, and I've investigated hundreds of avalanche accidents and fatalities through the years. So I've seen a lot of bad things happen. It makes me very risk averse. So my wife has a little forward in the third edition of this book, and she says, when she tells a story when Bruce and I first started dating, which is well over a quarter century ago now, she thought, oh cool, I'm with the avalanche guy, we can go ski and snowboard and all these great slopes that are that everybody else is too afraid to go to. And she found out pretty quickly that I was just nothing but a big chicken. I was just going to gentle slopes all the time, and she thought, when can we ever go and have some fun on the steep stuff? And she just found out I was very, very cautious. And so she said, believe what this guy's telling you in the book, because it's true. He's very cautious.
Tanya asks, how far apart are trees that are considered sparse/obstacles to hit versus close enough to be good anchors to prevent avalanches?
Yeah, good question. The rule of thumb that we often use is if they're thick enough that it's hard for you to ski or snowboard through, then they're probably thick enough to be effective. But if you can comfortably ski and snowboard through trees like that, they're probably not offering all that much protection. So that's kind of the general rule of thumb.
Is that going to be true even if the trees start at the top of the slope?
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, different kind of trees are different. Like aspen trees don't have branches frozen into the snow. They're like telephone poles. Whereas a spruce tree or a Douglas fir or something like that, they've got those evergreen branches frozen into the snowpack, into the slab. So they're better at holding a slab in place than a aspen or a birch or something like that.
Okay. Do couloirs tend to have more stable snowpacks than nearby open slopes due to holding deeper snow, sloughing during storms, or being sheltered or protected?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'd say I've seen it both ways. So a lot of times, if you know what you're doing with avalanches, you see places where avalanches are obviously running a lot and coming down through couloirs and smacking into the slopes below them. So they're getting impacted fairly regularly from them. And so that actually stabilizes the snow. But, in the couloirs, there's more avalanches there because they kind of combine the snow and they're steeper. So that's the trade-off, that when you do have a crosswind blowing, it drifts into the sides of couloirs and you have more avalanches there, or they get top loaded. And sometimes there's less avalanches there. So I don't know if there's you can hang your hat on that. It's better just to take a good avalanche class, learn about snowpack and how to analyze snowpack, how to jump on test slopes, how to test it. I mean, the stuff is not rocket science. You can learn this stuff and you can get good at it.
Heidi asks, ridges are often considered safe. Please elaborate on situations where they are not. Clearly, slope angle still applies. Cross-loading is possible. Persistent slabs can broadly propagate, and so forth.
Yeah, I think she just said it all, that generally ridges are considered safer because if an avalanche does break, it breaks below you instead of above you. And the snow that's above you can bury you, but any snow that's below you can't bury you. So that's why ridges are safer. But you can trigger avalanches on ridges. Let's say you're on a flat ridge and the ridge gets steeper and steeper. Well, there you're right back to slope angle again. So the closer to 39 degrees, the more dangerous they are. But if you're on a flat part of the ridge, and I showed you some pictures of the exceptions where it does suck up onto the flat part of the ridge, those are relatively rare. Most of the time you're fairly safe on that flat part of the ridge. But when it's really unstable and you've got a really hard slab and a bad persistent weak layer, then I kind of take a giant step back from the edge, in addition to the giant step I've already taken back from the edge. So I'm cautious of those things.
Okay. Paul asks, most professionals talk about the benefits of using CalTopo for terrain management in the planning phase, I suppose, of a tour that you're planning. Can you talk about the traps or downsides of terrain mapping, custom DEM shading? It seems like a few current accidents have had great tour plans using CalTopo.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar with that map. And what was the first part of it?
Well, CalTopo is just one where you can plan your route before you go out.
Okay, Cal, spelled C-A-L?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm not familiar with it. So it's probably just like
that shading, it has the slope angle shading.
Yeah, and it's like what we just talked about, that's based on DEM data, and don't walk up to the edge of the red line on the shaded part of the map and think that you're safe on one side of the line and dangerous on the other, because it's the data that's based on is just not accurate enough to be doing that. Use them as a general pre-trip planning tool, not as a specific one. And people are always wanting to invent gizmos of the ski pole handle that vibrates and turns red when you're, according to the GPS, you're on a place that has that, where you're on a steeper slope and a bad aspect according to the to the avalanche advisory. And you just can't do something like that. You can't take all the skills that a guide would know and everything, all the skills that you learn in an avalanche class, and put it in a ski pole handle or build it into your beacon or something like that. It just doesn't work that way. You can't guide from the desk. You got to learn that stuff yourself, and which is good, because that's the fun part, is getting out there and learning. Jump on test slopes and all this stuff is self-explanatory if you just go out there and look and spend some time.
Marika asks, is there an easy trick to estimating slopes? So we've talked about phones, cell phones, and apps and such, but before there was that, or let's say you didn't bring your phone or the battery died or whatever, you got any other slope advice? Slope angle?
Well, yeah, maybe some of you are old enough to remember these things called compasses. You tell the direction using a magic magnetic thing. But a lot of compasses have a little inclinometer built into them, so you sight along the top of the compass, and using the mirror, you tip it back and you can see how steep the slope is. So that's one way to do it. You can buy an inclinometer that we all used to wear around our neck, that you sight through them, and that they're very accurate. A little clinometer. They cost about $100 for the good one, so you can use those. These days the phones do everything, so I end up using the phone most of the time for that kind of stuff. So does that help? And there's some methods where you can use your ski pole, the trigonometry of your ski pole, and then dangling it down. In the last edition of my book, I showed that, because they teach that in Europe a lot, and I think it's inaccurate enough that I don't think it's a good thing to teach anymore. I left that out of the third edition of the Avalanche book. So I hope that answers your question.
Mel is asking about aspect. Does that aspect play a major role in creating avalanche-prone terrain?
Yeah, aspect plays a major role. And I didn't talk about aspect today. Like I said when I started out the webinar, that I'm just talking about terrain. And I didn't put any snowpack on the terrain. Now, when most people teach avalanche terrain, they kind of teach the 5 A's. In other words, aspect and altitude and appearance are all part of it. So aspect meaning the direction it faces with respect to the sun, and the direction it faces with respect to the wind. Now, in my mind, both those things have to do with the snowpack, not the terrain. So I kind of took them out of my terrain lessons, because I want to make it simple to just look at pure terrain without snowpack on it. So you're looking at steepness and consequences and anchors. And then after that, then you can put snowpack on it, because then it starts to get a lot more complicated. Snowpack is complicated. And that's why when snowpack, weather or people are the question, terrain is always the answer, because it's the one thing you can always turn to.
Let's see. Do you ski with an Avalanche?
I have an Avalanche. I have a pack with an Avalanche, and I've used it for years. I've never had to use it. I hope I never will. You don't see them as often because the Avalanche airbags are getting so much more popular, so people are not using them as much as I've got an Avalanche airbag, 2 of them at home actually, but I end up not using them very often because I usually don't go to terrain where I need them. So I get a little lazy. I just don't want to carry the extra weight, to be honest. But yeah, if I was working as a professional doing avalanche control, I would definitely be using them. Or if I was, in the movies getting paid to put myself on the sharp end of the rope as an extreme skier or a snowmobiler or something, I would definitely be using it. But I find I don't use it as much as I thought I would when I got it.
Robert's asking if a slope has higher probability / lower consequence and seems safe to ski, says, can Bruce suggest ways to ski it that are safer, i.e. straight down at an angle, things like that, to minimize impact potential trigger of the slope?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's like I said in the introduction, is just a part of, it's a very important part of the avalanche game, but I wasn't talking about it today. So you can read about it in the book and a lot of different other places. But what that's called is what I call low risk travel protocol or ritual, low risk travel ritual. And then I have my 10 commandments of low-risk travel ritual that you can read about in the book. And I don't think I can recall them off the top of my head, but it definitely starts out with, one at a time, that only expose one person to that hazard at a time. So if you're descending, then the first person goes down and puts a good slope cut across the top of the slope, a couple of them maybe, to test the slope. So, and I'll talk about that next, but only expose one person to the hazard at a time. Then they get off into a safe spot where they can perform a rescue if the next person triggers an avalanche, and so on. So you always have somebody in a backup, or at least just spread the group out. If you've got a big group, split them in half or spread out. Distance is your friend in avalanche terrain. And then speed is your friend too, because like I was talking about with the slope cuts, people used to call them ski cuts, but you can do them on a snowboard or a snowmobile too, so I call them slope cuts. Just get your speed built up, go kind of 45 off the slope. And so in theory, if you do trigger an avalanche, then your momentum will carry you off that moving slab and you can get onto a gentler piece of terrain or get into thick trees or something like that where you can grab a tree. So that's a slope cut. So those are just a couple examples of how to travel in avalanche terrain.
Well, time is winding down here. The next question in line was Brian's, and he's asking, do you know if there are lists of routes in Washington states with terrain ratings? And I can answer that because we're at the end of our presentation tonight, and we did say that we're going to give away some copies. We have 3 copies to give away of the new Staying Alive in Avalanche Terrain, 3rd edition. And we'll get those, we'll select those winners and in the drawing and get in touch with them by Friday. So if you didn't win a book this time, you can find it wherever books are sold. This is Staying Alive in Avalanche Terrain, and also on our website, mountaineersbooks.org, where if you use this code, STAYSAFE, STAYSAFE, you'll receive a 20% discount on all of Bruce's books, and also on, this is to answer your question, Brian, backcountry ski and snowboard routes. We have guidebooks for California, Colorado, Oregon, Utah, and Washington, what you were asking about. The one in Washington was written by guides at Pro Guiding Service, and they're there's an avalanche rating in all of them, on all of the routes. So anyway, don't worry if you didn't get that code. It is Stay Safe at mountaineersbooks.org. But if you didn't get the code, don't worry about it. We're going to send you a recording, and we're going to send you a 20% off. Essentially, we'll send you that code again, so you can get 20% off of Bruce's book. I highly recommend this book. We do have another one at Mountaineers Books that Bruce had mentioned earlier. It's for like scientists, which I'm sure is why he read it. But Bruce's book is super readable. It makes this rather complex subject, breaks it down into steps and things you can remember. So yeah, look for that email. And we're going to have the next web episode in late March, We'll have more information about that as the date gets closer. We hope to see you then. And that's all for tonight. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Good night and have a great weekend, everyone.
Yeah, stay safe, everybody.
One more thing. We didn't get to all of the questions. Bruce, there's a whole passel of questions here. So sorry to dump on you, but we're going to send them to you. And Bruce will respond to you guys.
I'll respond to them.
All right.
All
Thanks
right.
again.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.